It's now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Franz Fischler, who is a former European Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. With a background in agricultural science, Fischler's career in the agricultural public sector began in 1979 when he joined the Tyrol Chamber of Agriculture. There, he focused on environmental issues, education, and culture. In 1989, Franz Fischler was appointed Austria's Federal Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. Fischler played a key role in the negotiations for Austria's accession to the European Union. From 1995 to 1999, he served as the European Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. From 2005 to 2011, Fischler was president of the European think tank Forum Alpbach. Today, he continues focusing on consultancy work, delivering lectures and speeches, and fulfilling his role as president of the Ecosocial Forum Europe. We welcome Franz Fischler to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to this really very important conference. And I was invited to speak about the role of religions in the EU's social cohesion. So therefore, it seems to me logical to begin by clarifying what is generally understood by social cohesion within the European Union. In the Lisbon Treaty, on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, social cohesion is regulated alongside with economic and territorial cohesion in the articles 174 to 178. The underlying objective is to, I quote, promote the harmonious development of the Union as a whole. This is no simple task, given the vast disparities in development which among the Union's 27 member states exist. Taking GDP per capita as a benchmark, the wealthiest population resides in Luxembourg with a GDP per capita of 127,000 euros, while the poorest is in Bulgaria with only 16,000 euros per capita. And the gap between the rich and the poor in the European Union becomes even more dramatic when comparing individual regions. The difference between the poorest and the richest region exceeds a factor of 20. Moreover, this issue of social inequality could become even more acute if the European Union expands to the Western Balkans or to Ukraine. The European Union aims to approach its goal in two ways. First, by attempting to reduce disparities in development through targeted funding programs for economically and structurally weak member states. And second, by striving to close the gap for the most disadvantaged areas. I do not wish to trouble you with the technical aspects of cohesion policy, but suffice it to say, at its core, the Union aims to achieve social cohesion through specific funding instruments and higher funding rates. During the current funding period, 42.6 billion euros will be allocated to member states whose gross national income lies below 90% of the EU average. The success of this policy has been mixed. Some regions have made considerable progress over the years, while others have seen little improvement. To give you a sense of the impact of these investments, in the present funding period, in the period before, from 2014 until 2020, more than half of all public investment in the targeted regions was financed by EU funds. This enabled regions in Eastern Europe to catch up with other EU regions, and on the other hand, income levels in the southern regions have stagnated and regional inequalities have increased. Nevertheless, the number of people affected by poverty decreased by 17 million people between 2012 and 2019. However, this progress maybe have been significantly reversed due to COVID-19 pandemic. It is therefore essential to regularly monitor developments in social cohesion and make the findings publicly available through the EU's cohesion reports. But does the approach outlined in the Treaty on the Functioning of the Union truly cover the full scope of what should be understood by social cohesion? Clearly not. The EU is still heavily influenced by its origins as an economic community. And the activities in the cohesion policies are nothing else than poor economic measures. If we wish to adequately address the societal dimension of social cohesion, we must engage with the key components of a functioning society: the activities of the civil society, the rule of law, the question of the best possible form of social coexistence, liberal democracy, fundamental rights, the role of communication, culture, and finally, the EU's role in promoting global social cohesion. I would like to focus on those topics which, in the context of religion, churches, and religious communities, play a special role in fostering social cohesion. First and foremost, this includes civil society engagement. The contribution of religious orders, the Caritas, the Diaconie, as well as the charitable organizations of the Orthodox churches, Jewish communities, and Islam cannot be overestimated. The social services they provide in healthcare, elderly care, education for the poor and for the refugees are remarkable and contribute very likely more to social cohesion in our society than some cohesion programs of the European Union. Secondly, I would like to address the EU's relationship with religions and religious communities, particularly its relationship with Christianity. Islam plays until now a minor role in the societal development of existing EU member states, but its importance is expected to grow through enlargement, especially to the Western Balkans, and due to immigration and birth-driven population growth in Muslim families. Also, it is often claimed that the EU is a Christian project. This is simply not true. Christianity is certainly one of the fundamental spiritual roots from which European social life has evolved. But the European Union is most deeply shaped by the Enlightenment and to some extent by Judaism, the cradle of Christianity. And these three sources do not contradict each other, but nor are they completely congruent. It must be emphasized, ladies and gentlemen, that the European Union was essentially founded by politicians with Christian backgrounds. Unfortunately, there was no woman among them in that time. Just to mention a few: Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, Konrad Adenauer, Joseph Beck, Alcide de Gasperi, and many others. So we may recall the attempt to create a constitutional treaty for the European Union. In this context, there were heated debates about whether God should be mentioned and how the relationship with religions and churches should be framed. Although a constitutional treaty never materialized, churches, religious and non-confessional communities are taken seriously in the current EU treaties. In the Lisbon Treaty, so no specific religion or belief system is given precedence. What is expected of religious and philosophical communities by the European Union is that they respect the also in the treaty mentioned EU values, its objectives, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This foundational understanding is already expressed in the preamble to the Lisbon Treaty, which states, "The contradicting parties have decided to establish a European Union drawing inspiration from the cultural, religious, and humanist inheritance of Europe." And Article 17 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU defines the status of churches, religious associations, or communities, and the form of cooperation the EU seeks with them. It respects the status enjoyed by churches and religious associations or communities in the member states, in other words, the national status, and does not prejudice that status. Second, it also respects the status of philosophical and non-confessional organizations in the same way. And the Union maintains an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with these churches and communities, recognizing their identity and specific contribution. This so-called structured dialogue must be actively pursued by both sides. The European Union does not define itself merely as a community of interest or an economic union, but as set out in Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, as a community founded on values. And these values include respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Furthermore, it states that these values are shared by all member states and that European society is characterized by pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and gender equality. The values set out in Article 2 form the basis of the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights, which became legally binding in 2009. The Charter enshrines many humanist as well as Christian ethical principles and elements of Catholic social teaching. In terms of social rights, it goes much further than, for example, the UN's Catalogue of Human Rights. Its preamble speaks of a consciousness of Europe's spiritual, religious, and moral heritage, referencing the universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality, and fraternity, the core ideals of the French Revolution, a product of the Enlightenment, as we all know. And in chapter 1, this chapter deals with human dignity, adopting Article 1 of Germany's constitution on its inviolability. This entails a ban on the death penalty and asserts the right to live and physical integrity, the right to life and physical integrity, as well as prohibiting torture, slavery, and forced labor. The chapter 2 deals with freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and also provides timely protections against expulsion, deportation, and extradition. Chapter 3 addresses equality. Article 22 requires the Union to respect cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. It also affirms the right to equality and social inclusion for people not directly involved in economic value creation, especially women, children, the elderly, the sick, the disabled persons. Compared with other human rights catalogues, the EU Charter contains the most extensive provisions on solidarity, the very foundation of social cohesion. Initially, this chapter focuses on workers' rights, access to employment services, collective bargaining, dismissal, protection, and fair working conditions. It then expands to address bans on child labor, protection of the family, social security, health, environmental, and consumer protection, and access to services of a general economic interest that promote social and territorial cohesion. Later chapters address civil rights and the obligation of all EU institutions and member states to implement the Charter when applying EU law. And the Charter is part of the EU primary law and therefore supersedes national law. Violations may be challenged before the European Court of Justice. The European integration process resembles a roller coaster ride with many ups and downs, and this is likely to continue. Inspired by the desire to say never again war in Europe, the first joint project was to jointly manage the materials necessary for war, namely through the coal and steel community and the Euratom Treaty. However, when it came then to developing a joint defense policy during the Cold War, independence from the US and the USSR failed spectacularly, and the issue remains unresolved until today. Efforts then shifted to economic cooperation, Prosperity, after all, contributes also to peace. The first common policy was the common agricultural policy, since post-war Europe could not feed itself. We were the biggest net importer of food in the world. That worked until surplus production threatened collapse. The breakthrough came through President Jacques Delors, who tackled the so-called Eurosclerosis by creating the single market and initiating 300 legislative reforms. Yet Delors, a devout Catholic, remained unsatisfied. On February 4th in 1992, he told church leaders, I quote, "The Maastricht summit marked the end of the economic phase of the European construction. We must give a soul to Europe, a spirituality and meaning." And this aspiration was also intended to strengthen social cohesion. But this is a point where President Delors was not very successful. The idea of making social cohesion an EU policy goal was first discussed, very interesting, in connection with the UK's accession, to counteract deindustrialization in the Midlands and North. And with southern enlargement, cohesion policy became vital for addressing poverty in southern Spain, in Portugal, and much of Greece. Since then, with the exception of northern enlargement, including Austria, cohesion policy has steadily grown in importance. As mentioned, the exchange between religious representatives and the European Commission takes place through the structured dialogue. Even before the Lisbon Treaty came into force, President Romano Prodi had established a unit within the Secretariat General of the Commission for dialogue with religions, churches, and worldviews. And by the way, he appointed an Austrian ambassador, now Monsignore Michael Wenninger, as the first head of this organization. So you can see that Romano Prodi played not only a role in your context, he was really to some degree visionary in the he saw that it is absolutely necessary to establish a good relation with the churches and religious communities. So finally, let me turn a bit to the future. Which political fields will require the greatest efforts from the EU, churches and religious communities, to enhance social cohesion in the years to come? In my view, the most urgent task is to restore trust. Trust in democracy, trust in politics, in European unity, in the churches, in all public institutions, and in ourselves. Without mutual and self-trust, neither politics nor religion can function. Among various policy areas, the implementation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights is especially important because it requires no treaty change. It simply needs to be done. As mentioned, many of its principles align with Christian social teaching, but little of this has been translated into secondary legislation. This is largely the responsibility of the member states and the social partners who are central to implementing EU law. Here lies a vast area where churches and religions can and should be active. Likewise, the European social model must be further developed. This includes a better understanding of sustainability. Here, the churches can also contribute a lot. Handling migration and relations with the global south. A sensible approach to digitalization, AI, and biotechnology. And sustainability, ladies and gentlemen, is not just about greening the economy. It requires a resilient balance between economic, social, and ecological goals. We must not overlook the risk of segments of society becoming socially excluded or unable to lead meaningful lives. If social cohesion weakens, all other goals are in jeopardy. Migration policy must address different forms of migration in a more targeted and human way. Too often, especially in my home country, or as we say in Brussels, in the country which I know best, one has the impression that political debate is driven by populism rather than solutions. Digitalization and AI must be used wisely. We need strategies to mitigate social fallout and to develop a sound ethical framework for these fields. The same applies to modern biotechnology. In Austria, especially, we need to depoliticize this issue and move away from ideology. And finally, I'm often asked, what can an individual do to help? My answer is a great deal. If I do not speak up in my family, in my village, in my region, if I do not engage with the pressing issues of our time, then no political pressure will build, neither locally nor nationally, let alone at the European level. Change in democracy starts from the ground and does not fall from heaven. Another vast area for Christian engagement is a global responsibility. This is not about charity, but about our self-interest, particularly in Africa, where the population will double in the next 15 years, and where we have an average age of 19 years compared with the average age in the European Union of 45 years. So you can imagine what pressure will come up in the coming years. If we fail to generate growth and employment there, we can already imagine the impact on migration and security in Europe. Security at this moment is Europe's most urgent issue. Prayers for peace are good, but what we really also need now are concrete proposals on how to guarantee peace and security. It must be clarified, and here I think the churches should play a significant role in that. What does security really mean? What constitutes defense policy in this context? What tools are acceptable? How far should deterrence go? Is rearmament the only answer? What can be done against terrorism? So many questions. Now, there's no time to go into detail of all these questions, but I hope that church leadership will intensify its internal debates and decision-making on these matters, and bring this as a contribution also to the European authorities. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the topic of religion and social cohesion is much broader and deeper than it may first appear, or if one only considers the relevant treaty articles. However, important this debate may be, what truly matters is that we move from words to action. And in this, there's plenty of scope for every one of us to get involved. Thank you very much.